Hello, I'm Sean Lay. Welcome to the programme which brings together BBC specialists with the foreign correspondents who file their stories to audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, America draws its troops down and out of Afghanistan. Russia builds them up, but would it go into Ukraine? And the changing of Havana's Revolutionary Guard this weekend after 6 decades in charge. With me is the American Henry Chu of the Los Angeles Times, Italian writer and filmmaker Annalisa Piras, who joins us from Italy, and here in the studio at a safe social distance, the BBC's chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet. Good to have you, Lise, and good to have both of you with us on Dateline. Now, it was the 9/11 attacks on the United States in 2001 which led to the invasion of Afghanistan. President Joe Biden announced this week that September the 11th, 2021 will mark the end of its military presence there. 20 years ago, Vladimir Putin, already running the Kremlin, was one of the first to tell America's then president, "We'll back you all the way." Today, though, the capitals of what were the late 20th century's superpowers are in conflict once again over territory Moscow once called its own. Lise, how did allies against extremism become in conflict again right in the heart of Europe?
Well, there are areas where Russia and the United States are working together and will continue to have to work together for common cause. You mentioned about Islamic extremism, going back to the September 11th attacks, climate change. They're trying to get the Iran nuclear deal back on track. They're also working together on Afghanistan. But I have to say, sometimes speaking to Russian diplomats, what is the British expression, barely concealed glee that they see the United States, tragically, could face the same fate as Russian troops did when they left Afghanistan 30 years ago in 1989. In fact, I was in Kabul at that time, and a few years later, President Najibullah's government collapsed, and sadly that led to infighting among the Mujahideen groups, brutal civil war, which paved the way to the Taliban.
And a nasty end for Mr. Najibullah.
A nasty end, hung from a post in Kabul and tortured to death. The prospect, the spectre of a possible civil war is on everyone's mind, although everyone hopes it can be avoided. And when President Biden announced this week that it was time to come to an end, he said, you just can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. He said, there's been 4 U.S. presidents, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. It has to end. We have to close the book on this chapter. But he was at pains to say that America was leaving the war, but not Afghanistan, in the sense of that the United States would use all of its diplomatic weight and political, economic, humanitarian. But quite frankly, the biggest leverage the United States has in Afghanistan, particularly against the Taliban, is the troops. And there's worry about what will happen once the last of the troops leave before September the 11th.
Henry, it raises the question inevitably for all those who served there, for those families of those who died there, for those who still bear the injuries. Has the blood spilt? Much of it, I should say, Afghan blood. Many, many thousands of civilians. I think it's 8,000 just last year lost their lives. And the treasure spent, to use the words that soldiers talk about, blood and treasure. Has it been worth it?
Well, that's going to be on many soldiers' minds and the families of those who were lost, who fell in battle, because they can look back now at these 20 years and say what's actually been achieved in terms of the goals that the U.S. set out for itself, which were very ambitious. It wasn't just going in and rooting out terrorism and overthrowing the Taliban, which they did. But it was also these starry-eyed dreams of nation building, of creating a democratic society there, and a steady ally that we would have in Central Asia, and leaving it in much better shape than we thought we would leave it, and in the end depart. Unfortunately, those haven't come to pass. And this is tough for Americans, because Afghanistan, for many people, was the so-called good war. We had the disastrous invasion of Iraq, which many people were against, whereas with Afghanistan, there seemed to be much more common cause and solidarity behind that war when it was launched 20 years ago. And yet that has come to naught as well. There's that old phrase about Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires. Well, we saw that happen to the Soviet Union, and unfortunately, the U.S. is meeting the same fate there. So that's going to be on the minds of many Americans. But at the same time, there there is a big constituency of those who feel that enough is enough. You don't want to keep throwing good money after bad, and it's time finally to withdraw.
Annalisa, we are told that there was a process of consultation with the other allies, many of them European countries, who was part of the NATO-led force, are part of the operation and have been for the last 2 decades. General Nick Carter, the British most senior officer, was saying, well, this is not the outcome we would have wanted, which rather hints that it was more a fait accompli than a consultation. Are Europeans going to accept this? Are they worried about, in particular, the kind of Afghanistan that will emerge once they and the Americans have gone?
Of course, everybody is worried because it's very easy to anticipate what is going to happen, and the chances of a return to violence and civil war are very, very strong. But on the other hand, as we have just mentioned, this is not working. This is not producing the results that it was hoped would arrive, the building of a democratic society, so you can't go on forever. But there is a serious concern about what is going to happen there. I've just spoken with a good friend of mine who spent 16 years building schools for girls there, and he told me, you know, the charity we are talking to, they're just saying we are arming ourselves. If the Taliban come to get our girls out of school, we will fight.
So local charity workers are preparing to take that kind of defensive action because they're worried about what's left behind, and presumably the capacity of the Afghan forces to protect them.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, that gives you the sense of a society on the brink of a civil war when charity workers founding schools for girls are saying we are getting armed. So it's the return of a total civil war between militias, civil society, the Taliban. So it's very scary.
Liz, how does it look from the Afghan government side? Because you've been monitoring very closely, you've been at some of the peace negotiation meetings. Are they worried that this will finally tip the balance back in favour of the Taliban?
Well, I think after the initial shock when President Biden announced the dates, and it's a bit raw when you use September the 11th. I mean, we can see why they do it perhaps for an American constituency. But so many Afghans have died since September the 11th. But since then, you can see on social media, because social media, the propaganda war is a big part of the war on the ground, is that the Afghan security forces, there's a huge Afghan National Army and the police who've been trained by the United States and other NATO militaries. They're putting on a brave face saying, we will defend the homeland, and I'm sure they will. Even though we've had so many stories about poorly paid police and soldiers, sometimes not paid at all, in the provinces, abandoning their post when the Taliban approach. I've seen some of these special forces, really highly trained and motivated, to some 40,000 police and army. They will defend. They will fight to the last. They are not going, as in previous wars, just simply let the Taliban walk in to power, which is why there's an effort now, and now it's slowly being led by the United Nations rather than by the United States, to try to bring the Taliban to accept that, listen, you cannot rule like you did in the 90s, first of all, as harsh as you did, but on your own. You need to have something inclusive. And I know from talking to the Taliban in Doha, in the Gulf state of Qatar, where the negotiations have been on and off since September, they accept that. But they also believe they've won. They've acted like they've won. And when you get reports from the field, our colleague Sikandar Kumrani went to visit a Taliban area, they're not in the mood to compromise. They don't want democracy, however imperfect it was in Afghanistan. They want an Islamic state. And yes, they're very strict when it comes to social laws, not just about girls and women, but what about journalists? Journalism is one of the huge success stories in Afghanistan. Some say the Taliban haven't changed. The Taliban say they have changed. That is the big question. And it is nothing less than life and death. So I think there's still a chance this can work, but there's also a chance it won't.
Let's talk about the other aspect I raised in the introduction, Henry, and that's this standoff about Ukraine we've seen perhaps reach its peak this week. We had the troop border movements involving the Russians on the border they still have with Ukraine. Joe Biden responded by picking up the phone and saying, let's meet, let's talk. Yes, there are sanctions and complaints about what Russia's been doing. There's been a tit-for-tat expulsion of diplomats as the week comes to an end. But in the end, has America blinked first? Because it looks like Putin has mobilised his troops, rattled his sabre and got a concession, a meeting, a big meeting with the President of the United States.
Well, he hasn't actually said yes yet, and I'm not entirely sure that he will. I think it will still depend on how things unfold over the next couple of months before he actually accepts Biden's invitation. I mean, you can say that the West actually blinked in many ways already back when Crimea was annexed by Russia already. Russia's there, and then incursion into eastern Ukraine was already something that raised the hackles in the West, but that the West did very little about except for imposing sanctions that maybe did a little bit of damage, squeezed a little bit, but really didn't go that far. And now the sanctions that Biden has imposed further these last couple of days, as well as the diplomats being expelled, are also fairly moderate steps. He's trying to squeeze a little bit Russia's ability to raise money for its sovereign fund, but he's not going whole hog yet. And I think what he's trying to do right now, though, is to at least send a more consistent signal than the previous administration, because Trump, when he was president, on the one hand, did expel diplomats over the Skripal poisoning in concert with Western allies, and yet at the other time, on the other hand, we know he would toady up to Putin and flatter him. And in some people's eyes, actually, his campaign worked with Putin in nefarious ways. So I think Biden is trying to say now, look, that is over. We want to have a constructive relationship. It doesn't mean we'll agree on everything, and there will be antagonism going forward. And also Biden realizes that Russia's cyber espionage and hacking abilities have really been difficult for the U.S. and have compromised some of our systems. So, yeah, he's taking it slowly.
Liz, one last thought. Putin wasn't ever seriously going to send troops over the border into Ukraine, was he? Can he really afford, given the economic situation he's got at home, a war?
But it's interesting because we just mentioned what happened in 2014, yes, which was very secret. The Russians still deny that, yes, they went and annexed Crimea and went into eastern Ukraine. They didn't hide this at all. It's there for everyone to see, which is why some people have said this is about sending signals rather than soldiers. And yes, the Russian media, as you were saying, see this as a bit of a victory for Russia's really tough posture. And in fact, some of the Russian media have described Biden's foreign policy as bipolar disorder. On the one hand, you threaten to send 2 warships through the Bosphorus and then cancel it. You have NATO military exercises, but then you pick up the phone. Yeah. I think what's really fascinating in this is that on domestic and foreign policy, we are slowly beginning to understand who President Biden is. And he's surprising people. On domestic policy, he's surprising. And perhaps what he seems to be doing on Russia, we'll have to wait and see. He wants to get some issues off of the table. On Afghanistan, as we've just been discussing, he believes that the terrorism threat from Afghanistan can be dealt with without having troops on the ground, without fighting against the Taliban. He wants to find a way. They'll never see eye to eye. But they have to try to dial down the tension, because he's got China to worry about. He's got climate change to worry about. So let's just see going forward where he moves on this one.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you all very much. Annalisa, I mentioned at the start of the programme that you're in Tuscany. You're normally based in London. You're back home. How does Italy's situation now on fighting the pandemic compare with a year ago? Because Italy a year ago was the country that was worst affected in Europe, and things this year are still quite tough.
They're tough, but they're improving. As you rightly said, last year Italy was the hardest hit country in Europe. Now is the 7th in the world. It has been as dramatically hit as the UK. So it's not in that unfortunate first place in the number of deaths and so on. But things are improving. There has been a pickup in the vaccination rates, and the great news is that by the end of the month we will move from orange-red to yellow, which is the color code that says that restrictions will be eased restaurants will be open again to serve only al fresco, but it's going to be spring and lovely weather. So that is going to mean a lot. Also, psychologically, the restaurants can reopen with table outside. Schools have reopened. Shops will reopen by the end of the month. So the feeling is that slowly but surely we are getting towards a new normal. But you're right, the situation is still serious. The third wave, especially with the English variant at the beginning, now with all these other variants, still poses a big challenge. But vaccinations are catching up.
And in France, of course, the situation is much worse. I mean, 6,000 people in intensive care this week. That's the worst figure since the same time last year. And clearly the situation is not yet improving in France. Henry, how does it look in the Americas? I'm thinking in particular of the country you report for, the United States, for the LA Times, but also in Brazil, say, the other big country that has had a pretty rough time.
And where I was actually posted in Rio de Janeiro myself as a correspondent was just in Brazil last year, right before all of this broke. Starting with the U.S., there is a fairly successful vaccine rollout happening there, and that's led to, unfortunately, some complacency, so that although there had been a really promising drop in the number of infections across the U.S., we now see that either leveling off or even now going up again. And there are hotspots like the state of Michigan, which is actually in quite a bad way at the moment. And so, we've talked about vaccine hesitancy, vaccine diplomacy, and now there's vaccine complacency, the idea that suddenly we're protected and the reopenings can happen willy-nilly. So the U.S. still has to be vigilant about it. Now, they are nothing, though, in terms of compared to Brazil, which I think is a basket case at the moment under Bolsonaro's policy of essentially denying that this is a problem with a callousness that is almost breathtaking. I think just last week, when somebody pointed out that more than 4,000 or 5,000 people were dying a day, he said there's no use crying over spilt milk.
And that's a lot of milk, isn't it? I was looking at the figures. The first week of April, 11% of the infections worldwide were in Brazil and 26% of the deaths.
It's quite frightening. And unfortunately, he still has a base of support that will go along with him. He's not in danger of being impeached, which is what happened to Dilma Rousseff, the former left-wing president. And what's also being recognized now, though, is that this is not just a national tragedy. This is now an international threat, because you have a Brazil variant of the virus that could potentially be more lethal, more transmissible. And without it being tamped down in any decent way within Brazil, it's going to spread around the world. And so I think Brazil, unfortunately, doesn't seem to be going in a direction that any of us looking at it medically, or just the pure data of who's going into hospital and how many people are dying, can say is an upward trajectory.
And what about the US?
U.S., as I mentioned before, I think is actually on an upward path in general. They have to be careful not to become complacent that the vaccinations are going well. But my own state, California, has been cautiously reopening, even though it had a bad patch over the Christmas break and thereafter. With the vaccines picking up, the economy is picking up, and I think things are actually looking fairly well in the U.S. overall.
There's that move to get the governor out of office, isn't there, because of him being spotted having a meal with friends in a restaurant. Didn't send the right signals somehow.
In a very expensive restaurant.
Yeah, very expensive restaurant. Lisa, there's a danger, isn't it? Because, I mean, the US is still at the top when you're talking in absolute numbers, and it's perhaps not fair to compare big countries with big populations and small countries with small populations without talking about the share or percentage of people who are ill. But India is a big country, and its share of people who are ill is really high.
Oola. Sharp intake of breath. We're talking about a country, 1.4 billion people. The descriptions that are coming out of India now is a tsunami of cases. Phenomenal increase in cases. 200,000 cases a day. Over a period of 10 days, millions more cases. The hospitals are full, the morgues are full, and we've heard about Italy, we've heard about the United States. What happened was after November, we all relaxed, complacency. Oh, we've beat it. So the shops opened up, the markets opened up, and India went a step further. It had elections, boisterous, packed rallies. It had festivals like Holi and Kumbh Mela. It's still having Kumbh Mela, even though but 1,700 people tested positive in the testing that they did. India is now beginning to lock down a bit more, and the scientists are beginning to say, why is this happening? The dangerous part of this is that there's a double mutation in the Indian variant, and some cases are being spotted in Britain. So again, back to that mantra that we've heard time and again, no one is safe until everyone is safe. There's some real alarm bells ringing in India. They're starting to take measures and probably will do it. And they, of course, are our country which is manufacturing vaccines. They vaccinate about 100 million people, but they've got a long way to go.
Now, talk of vaccines takes us to Cuba. It's almost 60 years since Moscow and Washington faced off over Soviet missiles on the island. Khrushchev and Kennedy are long gone, but there's been a Castro in charge in Havana since the revolution of 1959. Until this weekend, that is. Friday evening, local time in Havana, we had this announcement at the five-yearly party conference, Henry, that Raul Castro, the younger brother of Fidel, I say younger brother, he's 90 now, 89. So he was still his younger brother, but obviously Fidel died 5 years ago. His younger brother is stepping aside. 5 years ago, he said, we're all too old, we need a new generation. Finally, the new generation is going to take charge. Is that going to change, do you think, the importance of Cuba in your country, in a state like Florida, where it still seems to matter in elections?
Yeah, it is hard to imagine not having the words Castro and Cuba in the same sentence, particularly for the U.S. and in Florida, as you say, where for such a small island, it wields an outsized influence in terms of its effects on our politics. I think the wooing that President Trump did of the Cuban American community, particularly, really helped him win Florida again back in the presidential election in 2020. And because of that importance in terms of their electoral clout in what is one of the most important states for any presidential candidate to win, Cuba will remain an important part of any candidate's and any president's calculation in what he does. Now, Biden, when he was vice president to Obama, was part of the baby steps that the Obama administration took to try to open up and be a bit more emollient towards Cuba. And Trump reversed all that. I don't think Biden's going to rush back in to do exactly what had happened before when he was vice president to Obama. He'll still take it a little bit carefully. But once Raul Castro is no longer actually in charge, it remains to be seen whether those who are still in the leaders of the Communist Party, which is what it's called, start doing the reforms that even they themselves several years ago said that they would do. They're only finally pulling the trigger on those. So let's see how that works and if that affects how Cuban Americans in Florida feel about the regime.
Annalisa, there was a time when the European left, certainly in the 1970s, saw Cuba as a great romance, the Castros as great heroes. I mean, I've lost count of the number of Che Guevara T-shirts I used to see when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s in the UK alone. Now, is it looked at rather different? Are they still heroes, or is there a sense that, you know, the revolutionaries became the dictators, like Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, and so Fidel Castro in Cuba, that the romance is dead?
Well, I guess that in reality, yes, it's dead, but you cannot take away your youth best memories. I mean, the songs and the T-shirts with the Che Guevara or the songs about Fidel, I mean, they will always belong to that period of idealism and utopia. So I think that will not change. But I bet that you will find very hard to find anyone who thinks that Cuba today is a model of a good government. So I think that's long gone.
Lisa,
not the songs and the T-shirts.
No, they will still be sold and they'll still be sung. Certainly on those long balmy nights in Havana. Maybe the old boys and girls will still be meeting even if they're no longer in power.
Maybe I should ask you a question, Sean, about Cuba and your romantic attachment.
Well, too young. I'm too young. You see, I'm like Annalisa. I'm a child of the 60s, but I wasn't a student of the 60s. I just wondered, though, on a serious point, I mentioned vaccine, Lise. This was always Castro's great ambition, that pharma was going to be, and it never happened. I mean, has Cuba ever really built the kind of identity it wanted once the Soviet subsidies stopped, the Venezuelan subsidies became much more unreliable, the independent Cuba, and still a terrible human rights record?
Well, we've been talking about health issues. I mean, Cuba still is praised for its health system, but in others it's falling short, and most of all falling short its own people. In fact, talk about the Cuban model, which was modeled on the Soviet, is now more Soviet than the Soviet Union, which of course is no more. And obviously you started by talking about the changing of the guard, the fate case of Cuba, but Castro is dead, long live Castro. The reforms of the economy has been very, very cautious. They've opened up social media, which means that there's more freedom of expression. And from what we understand is that at this very important meetings this weekend, they'll be discussing about how to open up without losing control.
And just on that point, it's worth quoting something that The Economist mentioned in a recent article. This is from a state newspaper headline. Dealing with the COVID crisis, it says, capitalism results in superfluous healthcare and socialism delivers it in just the right dose. So some things don't change, Castro or no Castro. That's it for Dateline London. My thanks to Lise Doucette, to Annalisa Piras and to Henry Chu. Thank you for watching. We're back next weekend. Goodbye.